This is, worst drum roll ever, the 50th episode of Better News Daily. Wow! If I had cake, I would eat it. Thank you so much for all of you who have been faithfully watching these. This has been a meaningful project for me to do, and I'm glad that it's been meaningful for you as well. Today, we have the least celebratory book imaginable to celebrate this milestone episode. It's the book of Job. You remember the story, right? Really rich, really faithful guy who loses everything in his life, and then he spends the whole rest of the book processing through why it happened with his friends. Now, I'll be honest, I have had a roller coaster relationship with this story. For a long time, this was the one book of the Bible that I just couldn't stomach. I didn't like how Job seemed to be a pawn in a heavenly chess game. It raised all sorts of questions. I didn't like how Job seemed whiny and self-aggrandizing in all of his speeches. The book just did not sit well with me. But I read through the book again last year, and this time I walked away thinking, even though I still had some problems with it, that this was one of my favorite things in the whole Bible. Go figure. I think that the beauty of this book lies in the struggle that it presents. The whole book is basically people trying to figure out, why do bad things happen to good people? An age-old question, right? Job's friends think, well, he must have done something wrong. And Job keeps professing his own righteousness. And it's all locked inside this worldview where behavior begets blessing. Now, this isn't the question that we're going to answer today, but I think it's important that we remember that when God actually shows up at the end of the book and talks to Job, he never answers Job's questions about why this happened. So when people try and form theologies about God causing or allowing suffering based on this book, I think we've maybe missed the whole point. Anyways, I don't want to dive down that can of worms. That was a fun way to smush two idioms together. Today, I don't want to focus on the theology in Job. I want to focus on the behavior in Job. Right after Job finds out about everything and starts to mourn, this happens. When Job's three friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. So there's a Jewish practice that comes from these verses in Job. It's called sitting Shiva. Have you heard this before? This is a foundational practice for Jewish mourning. Do you want to guess what the word Shiva means in Hebrew? It means 7. So Jewish communities will sit Shiva for 7 days after the loss of a loved one. And this means abstaining from certain pleasures, being with the grieving family, and literally sitting low to the ground. Most people trace this practice back to the Bible, whether it's here in the story of Job or to Joseph's grief over his father in Genesis 50. And I tell you what, the more I read about this practice, the more I absolutely love it. Just look at what Job's friends do when they show up. They weep aloud, they tear their own robes and sprinkle dust on their heads, they sit next to Job on the ground for a whole week, and no one says anything. They recognize that Job is hurting and afraid and depressed. They don't offer prescriptions for his pain or give him false assurances. They don't try to talk him out of where he's at. They just sit with him. Now, if you know the book of Job, you know that they do start talking. In fact, that's what the whole rest of the book is. The friends and Job share speeches back and forth. So what happened to the silence? Well, here's my reading of how this happened. The friends show up and they grieve with Job for a week, but then this is the very next verse after what we just read. After this, after the 7 days of grieving, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And then the very next chapter is where the lectures and the accusations from his friends begin. So, did you notice what happened? The friends were fine sitting with Job in his pain until his grief got ugly. The minute that Job opened his mouth and started to process through his pain in ways that sounded dark and unpleasant, well, then the friends had to speak up and correct him. But it's when they speak up that Job's depression actually gets worse. Midway through the book, Job finally says this, "I've heard many things like these. You are miserable comforters, all of you." Job's friends go from incredible comforters to miserable comforters really quickly. I once heard a pastor put it like this: Job's friends keep interrupting his lament to God. Even in the darkest things that he says, Job is still talking to God, but his friends keep trying to get him to talk about God. I think that just hits it right on the head. Most of the time, what we need is to just be with people in the midst of their confusion, their grief, their anxiety, their panic attacks, whatever. It's not about having the right things to say or providing the right emotional medicine. Just sit with people. Here's a catchy way to think about it. Speak less, say more. Just being with someone in a valley can often mean much more than anything you could say. We have to be comfortable with someone else's doubt. Let them vent their pain and say the wrong things and just listen. I'll be the first to say, I am incredibly bad at this. I love to talk and give answers and fix things. So when people are grieving, I get super uncomfortable because I just have to bite my tongue and listen. So I have 2 questions for you today. Here's the first. Why is silence in grief uncomfortable? This is especially true for Christians. Why do Christians often have a difficult time sitting Shiva, so to speak? Why do we want to give answers and encouragement first? I think this comes from good intentions, but what's the root of this? Does this maybe reveal anything about what we think about God? My second question for you is maybe a little more practical. Is there someone that you can sit with? Do you know of someone who is currently grieving something or wrestling with doubts or going through a valley in life? And if so, what does it look like to just sit with them? It depends on the person for sure, but what would it look like in general? I think when tragedy strikes, whether in whole communities or just in individual lives, what people want most from Christians is not a pick-me-up Bible verse or a wedged-in message of hope. It's shared lament. And on that cheery note, let's hit the randomizer. Make sure you subscribe before you leave this channel. I have no filler to put here. Tomorrow we will be in the book of Acts. Oh, I thought we were already in Acts. I guess we haven't gotten to that one so far. All right, we will see you tomorrow as we learn a little bit about something that happened during the first decades of the early church. Stop talking, Jordan. Okay, bye.